Good day everyone. From the Ateneo de Manila University Graduate School of Business, Master of Business Administration and Health program, this is our final report for Ethics in Healthcare, focusing on the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Act of 2012. We are from Group 1, composed of Elaine Grande, Michael Hamiana, Frederick Ocampo, and Robbie Jun Reyes. For the outline of the presentation, we will be first discussing the abstract, then we'll look into the recognition of an ethical issue, and we'll state the ethical issue, then we'll look into the current practice and response, and do a critique, and subsequently make recommendations regarding this. For the abstract, it has been 9 years since the historic passing of RA10354 in the Philippines in 2012. Prior to becoming a law, it has encountered substantial opposition from various groups, particularly the Catholic Church, with almost 86% of the population professing as Catholic in the Philippines. The Catholic Church has a substantial foothold in these issues. There were several issues raised during the RH bill debates, the most divisive of which include abortion, population control, and mandatory reproductive health education. This paper will revisit the points of disagreement on one of the three issues, specifically the mandatory reproductive health education from the perspective of the Church, the state, and the other relevant stakeholders. Specific sections of RA 10354 pertaining to this issue will be critiqued and discussed. Corollary to this, with the Department of Health as the lead agency for the implementation of the Act, and through the Department of Health, the current K-12 curriculum will be used as basis for the current response and practices related to this issue. The authors will utilize the concepts, theories, principles, and ethical frameworks discussed in class as basis for the discussion as well as the recommendations for progress and improvement. Republic Act 10354 Section 14, which pertains to age and development appropriate reproductive health education, states that the state shall provide age and development appropriate reproductive health education to adolescents, which shall be taught by adequately trained teachers in formal and non-formal educational system and integrated in relevant subjects such as but not limited to values formation, knowledge and skills in self-protection against discrimination, sexual abuse and violence against women and children, and other forms of gender-based violence in teen pregnancy, physical, social and emotional changes in adolescents, women's rights and children's rights, responsible teenage behavior, gender and development, and responsible parenthood, provided that flexibility in the formulation and adoption of appropriate course content, scope, and methodology in each educational level or group shall be allowed only after consultations with parents, teachers, community associations, school officials, and other interest groups. The Department of Education shall formulate a curriculum which shall be used by public schools and may be adopted by private schools. So in the outset, let us define what the issue is. So our point of contention here is the delivery of reproductive health education to adolescents with the following topics as enumerated before. Now let's define who are the stakeholders in this specific issue. Looking through section 11, the first stakeholder that we could easily identify is the state. And in this case, this is represented by the Department of Education or DepEd, which will be conducted through public schools, which is also considered one of our stakeholders. And apart from public schools, also a couple of private schools who would want to adapt this curriculum as well. Apart from the state represented by the Department of Education and the schools, one of our stakeholders as well are the adolescents. We also have the teachers, the parents, school officials, and other interest groups. Now, putting everything together, we have 5 stakeholders identified from the section mentioned before. We have the state through the Department of Education or DepEd, public schools, and to a certain extent private schools, which would also include the teachers and the school officials. Also, we have the adolescents, the parents, and other interest groups, in this case mainly the church. Now let's look at the interest and relative power over the decision of these different stakeholders. For the state, This is considered to be the primary implementer of the law. It has a significant power over the decision because it can repeal or revise the law anytime. For the second stakeholder, we have the schools, teachers, and school officials. This would provide the technical guidelines and actual implementation of the curriculum. They also have a significant power over the decision because they can control the contents and the manner of delivery of the subject matter. Third, we have the adolescents, which are the primary recipients of the curriculum. Compared to the other two, uh, the adolescents here mostly can provide feedback regarding the appropriateness and effectiveness. Given their age, most of their responsibility would be subsumed by their parents, which is also one of our stakeholders, and they could be additional sources of information. And they could exert significant pressure if there is considerable number with regards to this issue. Finally, we have other interest groups, specifically the church, which is primarily concerned with the morality of the curriculum. They could also influence their congregation to support or oppose the law. Now, let's revisit the issues by viewing previous clips regarding this.
Ng formal na reklamo kanina sa Quezon City Regional Trial Court ang 30 magulang para pigilan ang Department of Education sa pagpatupad ng sex education sa ilang mga eskwelahan. Suportado naman ng Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines o CBCP ang reklamo. Nagpapatrol Jeff Canoy.
Mga magkayakap sa dilim at mga nagtatalik na lalaki at babae. Ito ang mga imaheng ibinandera kanina ng Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines o CBCP. Naniniwala sila na walang lugar ang mga imaheng ito sa paaralan.
They also teach that to avoid sexually transmitted infections, all they have to do, and they list it all here, is reducing the number of sexual partners. Isn't it very absurd? And that's for high school.
Kaya't muling kinundira ng CBCP ang hakbang ng Department of Education na isama ang sex education sa mga subjects sa ilang elementary at high school. Ayon sa CBCP, mawawala ang pagkasagrado ng pagtatalik kapag tinalakay ito sa mga eskwelahan. Handa ang CBCP na makipagdialogo sa DepEd ukol sa issue, pero di mababago ang kanilang pananaw.
Never. It should always be based on a home setting, familiar, because of the natural bonds that exist between children.
Pero para kay Attorney Joe Imbong, na miyembro ng legal team ng CBCP, konkretong hakbang ang kailangan gawin para pigilan ng DepEd. Kaninang umaga, naghain siya ng formal na reklamo sa Quezon City RTC para pigilan ng pagpapatupad ng sex ed sa mga eskwelahan. Pirmado niya ang reklamo kasama ang may 30 pang magulang. Bagamat di nakapirma ang CBCP, suportado nila ang reklamo.
Like in America, after 30 years or more of sex education in all their schools, what was the result? Teen promiscuity, sexual permissiveness among teenagers, rise in teen pregnancy, rise in teen contraception, and also it resulted in a rise of teen abortions.
Pero nanindigan si DepEd Secretary Mona Valisno na walang malaswa sa gagawin nilang pagtuturo dahil siyensya ang kanilang magiging batayan.
Hindi ako nainis. As a matter of fact, mabuti nga franco sila nagsabi, nagulat nga ako eh. But I think siguro kulang talaga yung information dissemination that siguro kailangan pa namin magsalita pa. Pero kasama po sila sa decision-making process.
Haharapin naman ng DepEd ang reklamong inihain ng mga magulang. Nang dahil sa issue ng sex education, muling masusubukan ang linyang naghihiwalay sa relihiyon at gobyerno sa bansa upang malaman kung saan nga ba dapat matutunan ng mga ganitong bagay, kung mula sa magulang o sa guro, kung sa tahanan o sa silid-aralan. Jeff Canoy, Patrol ng Pilipino.
Hindi lamang sa eskwelahan kundi mismo sa tahanan dapat magsimula ang sex education. Ayon sa eksperto, ito ang pinaka-epektibong paraan para makaiwas sa hindi napapanahong pagbubuntis at pagkahawa ng mga sakit tulad ng HIV/AIDS. Nagpapatrol Atom Araulio.
Maselang usapin sa maraming Pilipino ang sex, kaya't kadalasang iniiwasan ang issue.
Pero sa panahon ng dumadaming bilang ng di inaasahang pagbubuntis at pagkalat ng mga sakit gaya ng HIV/AIDS, nagkukulang ba ang ating mga institusyon sa paggabay sa mga kabataan?
Ang 6 na taong gulang ni Nanay Anel nagtatanong na tungkol sa sex.
Kung tinanong na rin po ng anak ko yan sa akin kung paano daw po siya nabuo. Ang sabi ko po sa kanya na nagplant si Papa, tapos nag-meet yung sperm cell at saka egg cell, kaya yun nabuo.
Hindi naging bukas sa usaping ito ang mga magulang ni Anel noong dalaga pa siya. Kaya't ito ang gusto niyang baguhin sa mga anak.
Para aware sila dun sa mga nangyayari sa paligid ngayon, na maraming batang napapahamak dahil sa yung hindi nga nila natututunan sa magulang.
Pabor din si Anel sa mas komprehensibong sex education sa mga paaralan. Kahapon, namahagi ang DOH at ang DepEd ng mga pamphlet sa 6 na eskwelahan sa Maynila bilang bahagi ng kanilang kampanya kontra HIV/AIDS.
In health subjects, mayroon ng portion doon kung saan dinidiscuss ang prevention ng HIV.
Pero puna ng mga eksperto, hindi ganun ka-epektibo ang sex education kung eskwelahan lang ang magtuturo nito. Ayon sa isang parenting expert, mas mahalaga pa rin ang gabay ng magulang at dapat itong simulan sa murang edad.
Pag ang paaralan nagsabi, parang sinabi lang ng teacher ko, pero pag sinabi ni nanay, yung nga sinasabi natin sa mga magulang, hindi nila alam na malaki ang impluensya nila sa mga bata. Kaya kailangan magsalita din ang magulang in addition to the explanation o yung pagpapaliwanag ng paaralan.
Dagdag pa ng mga eksperto, ang sex education ay isang malawak na paksa na hindi lamang nakatali sa usapin ng pagtatalik. Dapat ding matalakay ang mga isyu tulad ng relasyon, pamilya at seksualidad para ganap na maunawaan ito, lalo na ng mga kabataan. Ato Maraulio, Patrol ng Pilipino.
In today's changing world, growing up isn't always easy. Imagine being without accurate information and reliable skills as you navigate the journey to adulthood. Do myths end up masquerading as reality? Do peers, television and the internet stand in for reliable resources and information from caring qualified adults? Fortunately, comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, can make this journey easier, more certain and healthier for many young people around the world. You may know CSE as life skills education, family life education, or HIV prevention education. No matter what the name, CSE aims to ensure that all young people develop the knowledge and skills to make conscious, healthy and responsible choices about relationships and sexuality. CSE has always been a part of many cultures. Often family members taught young people about puberty, sex and relationships. Now, as societies change, the responsibility is increasingly shared with health workers, teachers and schools. CSE in schools is led by trained teachers and professionals. It focuses on the development of practical skills and knowledge that is scientifically accurate and comprehensive. CSE starts in primary school with age-appropriate content and builds on topics gradually as the child grows older and develops. It looks at human development throughout every phase of life, including physical, psychological, social and spiritual dimensions. CSE gives young people a chance to think critically about gender and about their role in their culture and society. It teaches about tolerance, non-violence, respect, equality and empathy. CSE shapes values, attitudes and decisions about relationships, including healthy sexual relationships when the time comes. With this knowledge and these life skills, it's easier for young people to decide if, when and with whom to have sex, and how to say no if that's not what they want. It's a fact. All the evidence shows that good quality CSE helps young people to delay their first sexual experience. It also helps prevent HIV, sexually transmitted infections, and unintended pregnancy. Young people deserve to be healthy, happy, and to realize their fullest potential. They deserve to grow up in a world with CSE, a much less scary, less confusing, and less harmful place than a world without it. As leaders, teachers and parents, we have the responsibility to act now, so comprehensive sexuality education is part of every young person's journey to adulthood, no matter where in the world they live.
Now what are the competing values given these issues? For the church, some of the parents and teachers, the mandatory curriculum would be something contrary to freedom of conscience, specifically to the educators who refuse to teach forms of family planning that violate their religious traditions. It could also violate the rights of parents to determine the education of their children if the proposed curriculum would contradict their religious beliefs. Now for the straight to the DepEd. Teenage pregnancy, based on the data that we have right now, is one of the most important problems of women today in the Philippines. And according to new data, 59% of Filipinos believe that early adolescent pregnancy is one of the most important problems. At the end of 2020, the POPCOM reported that 70,755 families were led by minors, and this is expected to balloon in the coming years without intervention. And the comprehensive health education is one of the interventions that we are considering in this case. Now, summarizing the competing values, we have here the freedom of conscience versus that prescribed by law. We also have the freedom of religion and public school instruction versus equality. Next, we look into the current response of the state with these issues through the Department of Education by looking into the policy guidelines on the implementation of the comprehensive sexuality education. Next, we have here the comprehensive sexuality education framework with the overall objective of having learned, empowered, and engaged Filipinos with 21st century skills. If we go down at the bottom of the framework, you will see here the curriculum support system. Most of them would come from the school. We also have people coming from the community, industry, and other organizations. Important to note though that the family is not included here. Going up, you see the core contents and standards included in this framework, which would include 7 concepts, 7 values, and 7 life skills, which would all be integrated to these different subjects, which would include MAPE, Araling Panlipunan, Edukasyon sa Pagpapakatao, Science, and Personality Development. For this slide, we would focus on the core contents and standards of the policy guidelines. Interesting to note that this curriculum does not only include the usual concepts that we have in our subjects currently, but also include values such as self-knowledge, self-respect, and down the line, and also practical life skills that the children and adolescents can use. Now we'll proceed with the critique of the issue by applying the ethical frameworks and principles that we use in class. Before we begin with our critique, let us revisit the competing values that we have mentioned before. For the church, some parents and teachers, the competing value will be freedom of conscience versus the prescribed law by the state. And then the other competing values that we identified are the freedom of religion and public school instruction versus equality. Going back to the competing values that we discussed before, we would be using the rights-based approach based from the European Convention on Human Rights in critiquing this issue. So according to Article 9, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change one's religion or belief in freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. On the other hand, the Human Rights Committee, held in the case of Westerman, also says that the right to freedom of conscience does not as such imply the right to refuse all obligations imposed by law, nor does it provide immunity from the criminal liability in respect of every such refusal. Furthermore, according to Article 18, this freedom may be subject only to such limitations as prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Furthermore, with regard to the concept of morals as a possible justification for limitations on the freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs, the community states that it derives from many social, philosophical, and religious traditions, and that consequently, limitations on the freedom to manifest a religion or belief for the purpose of protecting morals must be based on principles not deriving exclusively from a single tradition. Next, revisiting the contents of the reproductive health education, it's quite interesting to note that apart from the usual concepts and life skills, there are a couple of ethical frameworks that we can deduce from this, so we'll go through it in the next few slides. So as mentioned, part of the contents are the concepts and life skills, which would include physical, social, and emotional changes in adolescence, as well as knowledge and skills and self-protection against discrimination. Now let's proceed to the ethical frameworks that we were able to identify by looking into the contents of the curriculum. So one would be the common good approach, which is basically working for a common set of values, which is seen in the values formation. This is important because it guides students to establish their own system of values on which to base their moral decisions. Next, we look at a clip of Kohlberg's theory of moral development.
The basis of children's reasoning and judgments about moral decisions changes over time. Children between the ages of 6 and 10 tend to judge acts as unilaterally right or wrong, focusing on rules and consequences. Intentions are often neglected.
I'm going to read you a story now, and then I'm going to ask you some questions after I read the story, okay? Are you ready? Okay. In Europe, a woman was dying from a special kind of cancer. In the same town where the woman and her husband Heinz lived, a druggist had discovered a possible cure, but the medicine cost much more than the woman or her husband could afford. So Heinz, the sick woman's husband, then borrowed all the money he could, but still only had half of what he needed. Heinz told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell the drug cheaper or to let him pay later. The druggist replied, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." Heinz then became desperate and broke into the store to steal the drug for his wife. Should Heinz have stolen the drug? No. No? No. No.
Moral decisions at this age are made at the pre-conventional or conventional level and reflect either a punishment-reward orientation or the desire to obey rules and conform to social norms.
Why is it wrong?
Because you never know if somebody's having their policies up close, and maybe polices or spies sneaked in there who's stealing to turn you into a criminal. Because you might get caught. You'll be sent to jail. Even though she was sent to die, that doesn't give her to stay. No, even though that his wife was in desperate need, it's still hard to steal.
In middle childhood, children are only beginning to question the absolute nature of laws and rules and consider the impact of intentions on moral decisions.
Was it actually right or wrong to have stolen the drug?
I can see why he would do it, but I don't think it's right. And it wasn't okay, morally, but it's better than somebody dying.
I would say yes, because probably cares about his wife a lot and he doesn't want her to die. And say no because it's not good jobs here.
Related to this is the stages of cognitive development developed by psychiatrist John Piaget. This would include 4 developmental stages, which would include the sensory motor stage during the first 2 years of life, wherein the child begins to interact with the environment. And during the age of 2 to 6 or 7, we have the pre-operational stage, wherein the child begins to represent the word symbolically. Next, we have 7 to 11, up until 12, wherein we already have the concrete operational stage, wherein the child already learns rules such as conservation. Here we already see the use of logic, and this is the part wherein the comprehensive sexual education would already come in. And then finally, from 12 to adulthood, we have the formal operational stage, wherein the adolescent can transcend the concrete situation and think about the future. Another ethical framework that we were able to identify is the rights-based approach, which is protecting or respecting the moral rights. In this case, women's rights and children's rights, and sexual abuse and violence against women and children, and other forms of gender-based violence, and teen pregnancy. Another ethical framework identified is the fairness approach, wherein we expect to treat all human beings equally, this exemplified by the presence of gender and development. And finally, the utilitarian approach, where there is the goal is to minimize harm and maximize goods. This would include responsible teenage behavior and responsible parenthood. What is the primary reason why we need to introduce comprehensive sexuality education at an early age? So one of the primary prerequisites, as discussed previously in our ethics class, for us to be able to make an ethical decision is the presence of a consensus moral agent. And there are some aids and tools present that would help the child or the adolescent in making this decision. One is the presence of accurate and truthful facts. If we have the comprehensive sexuality education present, we would have a standardized curriculum that will provide the students the correct, up-to-date, and appropriate information needed, delivered by knowledgeable persons in a neutral but supportive environment with the ability to answer queries immediately and clarify issues whenever necessary. Apart from that, we would also be able to transcend one's own limitation and biases by exposing the child to these issues during adolescence, which allows early recognition of limitations and biases, comparison of differences in belief and value systems, consideration of alternative possible actions, and correction of it if necessary, and adoption of the practice if needed. This would also include consideration for others' interests by broadening of horizons beyond our own families, community, our own circles, and organizations. Also, openness to other thoughts and ideas. If we have the comprehensive sexuality education, this would allow open discussion of thoughts and ideas that are different to our own in a neutral environment with the capability of providing immediate feedback. Also recognizing cultural impositions, which is the ability to take a step back and look into the cultures and traditions that may be holding us back from advancing forward towards a more inclusive society. And finally, courage. If this is done in an environment like the school, we could get support and affirmation from a community or a group of people sharing the same belief and value system. Next, we go into the recommendations. Part of our recommendation in looking into this issue is applying a systems thinking approach, wherein practice informs theory and theory informs practice, and this is an ongoing process. So we have already discussed certain theories relating to the cognitive development and moral development, putting it side by side with the ethical frameworks that we know. We could use this to address concrete complex problems by using this as our framework in doing our solutions. And in using the solutions, we also need to look at the other stakeholders, not just the ones that we enumerated here, especially those that would have an indirect effect on these issues that we have. We could also look into local practices that we have right now and adapt whichever is applicable to our current issue. More concretely, for the issues that we mentioned before regarding the contrary to freedom of conscience, what we could do more concretely is to do a verification of the educator's preferences prior to subject assignment, and ensure that a certain percentage of those that are hired, trained, or assigned are willing or are comfortable to deliver the CSE curriculum. Or alternatively, we could have a dedicated pool of national teachers to deliver the CSE curriculum. It's also important for us to get constant feedback from the teachers handling the subject. For the second one, we would have to clearly state in the school orientation the CSE, the inclusion of the CSE, and enrollment of their child in the school would assume agreement with this. For current students, we would suggest to conduct CSE classes with some parents present to comment on the content and delivery of the topic. We would also want to give parents a specific and active role in the conduct of CSE classes, because CSE classes does not stop once the child leaves the school. We also need to create an environment in the home wherein this could be talked about freely, and also we need to ask feedback from the parents after their participation. In summary, we have looked into Section 14 of Republic Act 10354, or the Age and Development Appropriate Reproductive Health Education. We were able to identify the important stakeholders and the issues that are important to this, and we were also able to apply various ethical frameworks and principles that we have studied in class. To end, according to Dr. Benjamin Spock, a pediatrician, sex education, including its spiritual aspects, should be part of a broad health and moral education from kindergarten through grade 12, ideally carried out harmoniously by parents and teachers. Additionally, answering questions is a major part of sex education. 2 rules cover the ground. First, always give a truthful answer to a question. Secondly, regard sex knowledge as exactly like any other knowledge. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.